Okay, thank you all for those kind of stimulating lectures and presentations. There is themes that are running around along all the presentations, but I would like to kind of start with almost kind of more general questions that start kind of ticking into my head, and I think kind of be able to be addressed from all our speakers. Head and intelligence versus acephalous bodies and life or bio. And all of you have intellectually, conceptually have touched this kind of subject. What are the differences and how historically this one follows the other? How your projects, how your research address this distinction or this continuation of these two parts? We say polycephalus. For example, Harriet is talking about many heads, not just like one. And with Professor Rachel, we had more like bodies, liquid intensities, and fields.
But if I can say one thing, I think is also a way of, is a reading or is a paradigm through which you read intelligence. Because even human intelligence, you can consider a single head or a multiple head. Yeah. Like, for example, I was reading recently this book on the plasticity of the brain. So the capability of our brain on materially compute. So the brain could be read as zone or as a single brain, or can be read as a set of neural network that have an intelligence and relate one with the other. So I think it's really a sort of cultural paradigm of how you start to read information and intelligence, and material intelligence is more distributed rather than concentrated. And I was quite intrigued by the fact that neuroscientists are describing this shift of reading the brain as a zoning system to reading the brain as a form of distributed intelligence. And urban designers are discussing, we move from the model of zoning to the model of distributed intelligence. So
okay,
there is a parallel there.
What is intelligence? I know there is a parallel, but it's kind of something to mobilize a discussion and I think to clear up terms. Because I think we listen a lot today, I don't know what happened yesterday, but today about AI, artificial life, we talk about heads, we talk about acephalous bodies, we talk about borders and liquids. Where are we? And this is something like cultural, political, and architectural that needs to be addressed.
I think it's a good question because I think that the idea of intelligence needs emplacement because it is one of those ideas that is highly contextualized depending on who is observing intelligence. Obviously, you know, Alan Turing's concept of intelligence as being something actually that is self-referential. If you, with your set of experiences, recognize intelligence in something else, then that is one way of looking for it. And he came up with that as almost like let's call it an opinion-based or a subjective form of analysis. And that's very different to objective, ultimate kind of final definitions. And I think when we're dealing with hypercomplexity, so like life, like intelligence, like human, you know, these definitions are not exact. And so I think that, you know, what the challenge that was said is really interesting because it's emplacing a set of tools through which we have been working with, observing the world through, within an ecological context. And if I think I was going to say that there was one theme here that could start to emplace all these different tools and technologies and, you know, methods that we're working with, it is that transition from the industrial to the ecological. It's not either or. You're actually looking at something I think that both Marco and Claudio brought out beautifully. It's some kind of weird hybrid because we are in transition towards something else. And I think that that's really interesting. I think it's come across in all of the work so far.
Yes, and exactly at that point, that transition, I want to kind of make some kind of an afterthought of kind of work. Because we are in this transition, Marcos Novak, as you mentioned, the liquid architecture, the last 30 almost years, we're still exploring the liquidification of the borders, right? And this kind of liquidification has become almost like a cultural paradigm. There's no limit between work and play. It's becoming, as we were discussing this morning, the ideology of the neoliberal regime. So the question is, how then we stand in front of the liquidification of the body or the borders, and then the need of heads and recognition, which actually means distinctions, which actually means creating borders and abstracting. And I think this is why we moved from artificial intelligence to artificial life, and now back again to heads and intelligence, precisely because there are this kind of limits. And I think Harriet can actually, Heather can actually explain if a slime mold make decisions from abstracting information from the environment or not.
You're talking about the head as the leader of decision-making and the centre of intelligence, and I think the slime mould and other examples are of a distributed intelligence that is extended across the entire body of the organism or the system, or extended beyond its physical body to the traces it leaves in the environment or the information it leaves. So maybe we need to rethink about where the intelligence lies, kind of physiologically, and how we can kind of employ that or engage that in the way that we think about human-scale systems that combine technology and are situated in the physical, natural world. And so, yeah, I think we tend to think of intelligence very much from our own position. We are entirely human-centric. And I think what other organisms that are kind of, such as the slime mold, that are very alien from us, but demonstrate behavioral properties that we can recognize kind of in ourselves and our systems, offers an opportunity to try to shift from a human-centric position to looking at other systems and how they are working and what that intelligence means. The example of the maze, the conclusion from that scientific experiment was that the slime mold demonstrated a primitive form of intelligence. That got them into huge trouble within the scientific community. So, coming back to Rachel's point, it depends very much on context and culture as well. For that team, it was largely Japanese-led, and for the Japanese culture, strongly embedded within animism, everything from a human being to a stone has a form of intelligence. So it's cultural as well as contextual.
Thank you. Okay. Anyone else wants to add to that?
I just want to say that, there is no, obviously, living organism that has no intelligence, and whereas it has a head and body, or whereas it has a body without head, or how many heads, and so on. But what it does change in the living organism is the level of adaptation. And the series of behaviors that this brings to adaptation. And to my understanding, we are really starting to cross that borders from that static to more fluid, to more dynamic, because we are, first of all, in the context of a social, economical, and environmental crisis, and on the other hand, we have the power of knowledge, distributed knowledge and technology, so we ask more from our environments. And then, as always, we go back to nature, and we go back to biology, and we go back to basics to understand that kind of collective intelligence, how it can give us probably, let's say, processes or ideas or the start of solutions that could be applied into our built environment. Because our built environment, by default, it never had that basic principle of adaptation. But on the contrary, like going against the environment, being protected by the environment.
Now, maybe I just can tell a little story from these days, setting up this exhibition, and I'm just relating to the presentation of Eduard, which I had to leave, I think. But I like his work a lot, but in particular I was enjoying looking him setting up this drawing machine, if we want to call it like that, which is his installation, and clearly there was a kind of leading intelligence there, which was him meticulously designing, installing every little device. I'm sure you saw in the pictures, everything was accurately machined and perfectly positioned, etc., etc. But then, of course, when the system was switched on, there was the necessity to program it, to define the way these fans would operate. And so you have this microprocessor, the Arduino, which arguably is another form of intelligence that was programmed by Eduard or with his programmers, and that would again communicate to the fans a certain sequence of information that would come from data collected in these maps, no? And then all of a sudden we began to test the machine, and in the middle of the space we started to observe a certain formations, which almost like a little tornadoes, no? Which you can see quite clearly when you spray the ink or the water at the beginning to test, no? Again, this tornado, this mini tornado in itself is arguably what creates the drawing in the end, no? Because it's the kind of emerging mechanism that sort of spreads the ink and then in time would create the final pattern, no? So it is another form of intelligence that is somehow emerging in the mechanism. So again, for me, it was quite interesting to observe, and I was thinking myself, where the intelligence lies, and I think that it is probably impossible to define a univocal form of intelligence there, and maybe depends on the frame, of course, that you depict, and in that sense the multiplicity of heads for me really also relies in how we frame it, and also the fact that we can fluctuate our frame of these experiments and change the scale or the let's say the level at which we look at this experiment and find different form of intelligence at plays at once, no? And I mean, if you compare that with the sort of let's say more traditional image of the architect sketching, his kind of genius solutions, etc., it's a big shift, no? But at the same time, clearly there is a very strong authorship in the project, no? So it doesn't mean that all of a sudden the drawing emerges on its own, and it's some kind of self assembled entity which has no authorship, etc., etc. So it's just an observation, but again, for me, I'm, as I was reflecting upon this idea of many heads, and I think that just looking at this project just provided a very interesting way of thinking about it. And I think as a designer, for me, it's the best way is to really try to take some of these projects as a kind of a tool to think and to elaborate the way we understand intelligence and the way we understand the role, of designer within this framework of distributed intelligence, if you want, that we are testing in this exhibition.
Well, just to underline what you were saying, and also what already was commenting before, I think that we are in a moment where we are actually understanding that exist different forms of intelligence, robotic intelligence, organic, human. There is also organic, actually. But now we are, even here in these discussions, we are just trying to understand how they can start to talk to each other. And how they can start to create even an internal relation, internal symbiotic association, let's say, that really take the added value that each one has and combine it into one unique method, new design vision that can be applied as Ecologic Studio does, and many others are also experimenting even to the city that has a scale that you wouldn't expect if you think about bacteria. So it's a moment actually where we have intelligence, but there is a lot to learn from the combination of all of those different agents.
I'm just going to add a little brief note here. It's actually an anecdote or a question rather, and it's not. I didn't think it out, but so who's more intelligent? Deep thought, who's an IBM supercomputer or a rabbit? Okay. Who's more intelligent?
It's more than it's okay.
So and you can answer it by another question. If you throw them into the water, who swims out? So it is about to say actually that we can understand intelligence in so many ways, and it's a matter of perspective. I think now more important even is to understand how we can use it and how we can benefit from it.
The strong opinions.
Yeah, I think it's, for me, it's becoming clear actually that intelligence is a value judgment, because everything is making decisions. It's really, there's a value system in place that says that's intelligent, that's not. It's deep thought, I'm valuing the machine over the organic, or the other way around. Neither is right, neither is wrong. So I think what's interesting is that, when you're talking about, how do these different spaces talk to each other, we've got a massive, hyper-complex, heterogeneous landscape for design right now. In an ecological era, it is no longer simply about making, kind of fantastic objects. And I mean, I love objects and I love machines. I mean, I think they're fantastic. But I think that our priorities are shifting. And we've got a number of authors that are writing really incredible stuff about ecology. So Timothy Morton is, and Paul Kingsnorth, and what's interesting about that is that the landscape for possibilities opening up. So, for example, Tim Morton is asking, how do we design with metabolism? That's the question that, that you guys were asking, in this environment and during the Biennale. And the question, the answer is actually we don't know, but we can actually make incursions into those spaces. But because there is no single answer, I think we have to go with an ethics and value system. We have to bring something with us against which we're making our judgments. And I think the process for producing work in this environment is actually very different than in a deterministic realm where we know there's a good and a bad and a right and a wrong, and this kind of dualistic framework in which many of us have actually grown up.
Yeah, I probably this doesn't work, I use this one. So, in fact, what I wanted to add is exactly this. It depends from the framework at which you're looking at intelligence. And I probably mentioned this briefly yesterday. Again, talking with Mario Carpo in UCL once, he was making this parallel, is something he's researching between the craftsman producing an object and the capability of a robot of artificial intelligence to produce an object. In this case, could be a wood artifact. And he would say, the artisan in itself is capable of feedback loop. But the robot and artificial intelligence, the feedback loop is much faster. So the production system can be speed up and we can learn in a much faster way. Well, I raised my hand and I said, well, yeah, that's possibly true, but that's because in your framework or in the framework you are discussing, you're taking in consideration the loop of information. So if we consider information as an intelligence, then yes, the artificial intelligence is faster than the craftsman. But what if we consider intelligence as the mix of matter, information, and energy? So the morphology related to the feedback of the energy and the feedback of the information. So then the artificial intelligence is still far more rudimental, in my opinion, than the craftsman. Where are the data coming from? From a server. Where is the server? Is this located? Where is the energy that supports the server? And how is it related to the morphology? It's not related. The server just sucks energy, doesn't feed back. The craftsman had a feedback loop. Feed himself, how he feeds. He changes material. His material influence the information it's producing. So the system craftsman object, morphology, energy, and information is much more embedded and sophisticated still than what we have with artificial intelligence. So how can we cross this hybrid of biological and artificial intelligence and try to reach a higher level of sophistication in this integration? Because I think it's how as human beings we make sense of things, and sometimes our framework, we limit the framework through which we need to make some limit to our framework. But if we limit too much, then we leave outside certain element.
Okay, that will lead me to another question, because how we can judge where we limit or not, and how this can be related to the concept that's kind of circulated this morning of the discussion of Timothy Morton with the dark ecology, what the dark in the ecology means, and how we can actually create that limits. Therefore, we're talking about lines again and borders. What dark ecology means for you?
For me, dark ecology is Timothy Morton's aesthetic. So, I mean, his preference is for the Gothic, because he has a rather kind of romantic view of the destruction that is happening through the environmental crisis that we're immersed in. I think there are other aesthetics that can also emerge from a rereading of the natural ecology. And I think that in this, in this Biennale, we've seen some of those kinds of syntheses, reaching out into spaces where these platforms that will start to cross over can actually take place. So for me, dark ecology is an affect and an aesthetic that's actually drawn our attention to change. And again, it's asking us about ethics, value systems, what's at stake, those kinds of things.
To me, maybe a step further from aesthetics that has been discussed a lot in the morning as well, I think that the idea of dark ecologies is integrating the agent of human, the agents of nature, and the agents of technology in a kind of a coexistence during processes. And when we're talking about design, because at the end this is what we are talking about here, this is a radical change. Because, ecology has always been thought as a kind of a separate, let's say, idea or area from where design was operating. And now we're starting to merge those. And technology is allowing us to find merging moments for optimum solutions or for placing some cognitive decisions where there were not. And this is influencing radically not only the aesthetics, it's radically influencing the way we operate.
I want to come back on that, because Morton makes dark and aesthetics, but I think that what you're kind of pointing out is actually ecology is now a substrate for design, which is giving us a whole range of possibilities. And the notion of ecology itself has changed since Ernst Haeckel invented the term, and that was to do with just animal relationships. By the middle of the 20th century, we're now looking at the biogeosphere. And by the 1990s, we're including the urbanosphere, which is what Claudia Marco have written about. So ecology itself is undergoing a slippage in a kind of context of systems. And from that, darkness is just one of these kinds of ways forwards that we could take. That for me is Morton's view. But we were asked, what darkness meant to us.
I think
for me, it's what Humanos says all the time, that I don't really know what you mean, but Humanos always say when I playing with him about something, he's always say, stay with the trouble. So I think for me, dark ecology is a little bit stay within the trouble. So basically it's about, I don't zoom out and look at the efficiency of the system, and then understand that I can produce 250 million point tree component in 3 days. But I zoom in and relate to the system and try to relate human and inhuman parameter and see how they interact. So my understanding is a material understanding from within. Is not a logical understanding from above and management from above. So I manage from within what surrounds me and what I read. So I stay with the trouble, I'm embedded in the ecology, and therefore human and inhuman forces collaborate, and they are not managed from the top and therefore disconnected and zoned. So for me, that is the dark ecology, and dark is come from the fact that you stay within the trouble. So there is a trouble, and you don't try to confine it in a box. You live within it by interacting with it. And the aesthetic could be a way of interacting with the trouble, but there could be others.
I mean, like, if you relate that to cities, and, I guess this is pretty evident in the kind of, potential trap of the greening ideology, It's like, maybe the best example today is Stefano Boeri, that is covering cities with woodlands and so on. I mean, he's a great guy, but again, there is a certain connection between this aesthetic of the green and the kind of picturesque image of the tree and so on, a sort of kind of easy populist way of fixing the urban problems, which neglects, for instance, waste or wastewater, like the dark side of the city, which all the kind of aesthetic conditions that are associated with it. And I remember, like, now it's almost 10 years ago, the first time we started to play around with cyanobacteria and microalgae and so on. And like one of the reasons for doing that was that we just wanted to try to operate outside of the kind of sort of picturesque image of nature, and algae seemed to be abstract enough and small enough, yet manageable enough to be able to just think at them as a sort of green pixels, or something we could directly connect to our kind of digital drawings and maps and so on, and therefore like really begin to depict architecture or kind of urban diagrams within a new sort of a paradigm, which was of course aesthetic, but at the same time it just offered a kind of unbiased, if you want, approach to begin to talk about urban ecology and issues of waste and air pollution and so on and so forth, right? So I guess the two things are, for me, very connected, especially if you look at the sort of future urban approach.
Okay, I'll pause here because, as you realize, I'm playing devil's advocate here. And I'm trying to kind of push a little bit the discussion. And I will pick up exactly from what Claudia said about staying with trouble that is coming. Is a quote by Donna Haraway. And actually that's kind of related with what Areti was mentioning, the Capitalo scene, but Donna Haraway called the Cthulhu scene, which actually is taken from Lovecraft. And it is precisely this kind of expedition to the great outdoors, to the unknown. And this is kind of the dark at the core of the object, of the hyper object for Timothy Morton, as far as I can understand. But this is kind of brings me to kind of another kind of design attitude, because what I'm trying to kind of lead here is to what kind of strategies and tactics we can develop for this kind of post-Anthropocene if we recognize the Anthropocene as a problem nowadays. So this kind of great outdoors, Timothy Morton and Donna Haraway, is kind of kind of try to approach it, or what Professor Rachel called the oceanic, or the complexity. Instead of refraining from the complexity and say, oh, it's too complex, okay, this is my kind of solution, or this is kind of my kind of interfacing with that kind of complexity, what Timothy Morton suggests is speculation. And precisely speculation is to create artificially provisional limits, provisional borders, provisional ideas that can actually inform our reasoning for design. So this kind of this kind of discussion about the intelligence and then the dark ecology is precisely to see something that I have recognized into your work, that technology is used in a speculative kind of way. Do you feel that this is what you do through the technological integration of apparatuses, devices, organisms within your project, or technology for you is still a Promethean concept, something that is given to us in order to survive in this world?
So, I mean, the way I interpret Haraway's Thylacine is it's the age of multiples instead of single solutions, and an age of hypercomplexity and heterogeneity. And well, what that comes with is a certain amount of risk. And so I think that that's where the connection, so it's no longer a deterministic universe, it's a probabilistic one. That there is a probability of things happening. Some things have a higher probability than others. And so for me, that's where the darkness is, that kind of uncertainty. And I think this is the landscape that, you know, these cultural critics are kind of laying out for us. And so, you know, how do we design from an industrial age where we want to deal with certainty because there's a certain expectation that a product or a building works in a particular way. But when you open up the scale of the territory in which architecture can operate on, with ecology, for example, or even space, or beyond that, there are so many unknowns. So what are the tool sets then that we bring to the table in order to make the first incursions into the unknown?
I also think, talking about technology, I also think that we are a step further from the digital revolution or the information age that brought that boom of technology, and everybody was talking about technology and what technology can do and what are the possibilities or limitations or complications that technology can bring. I see that we are already stepping on the next step, which is more related with an experience age, with an age of participation, where the debate for technology per se is basically ending, and because technology is like silently on the background doing its work, and nobody cares about it because we are having all these wearables doing what they need to do, and I don't care about which is the exact technology that helps me to do that. But what I do care is how that behaves, how I behave together with that, how I interact with the rest of people or objects through that. And again, this is bringing a radical shift to design, because it's not anymore about getting the technology and see what we can do with that in design. It's really envisioning what is the shift we want to bring, and then we are finding the tools to make it happen.
So I just want to point on the connection between complexity and technology. I mean, I guess that probably the two can be strictly related if you think about technology as something that can make complex patterns emerge and basically, let's say, underline relationships among the parts of the observation that you are actually operating. So I think like it's just a medium, you know, it's a medium to better understand probably how to react, as Rodi also was saying, in our case through design, since I mean we are designers, and design is a decision-making process, you know, in the environment where we are all operating. So I just think like it's one of the agents that is part of a bigger equation, but can for sure contribute to a more evolutionary probably system, no, of design and understanding of cities.
Well, I tend to agree with this idea, and we can use technology and more particularly simulations to understand the complexities involved in designing the urban space, for example. One of the ways we've done it is used synthetic modeling. We kind of observe the phenomena that's out there, and then we try to model it, and then we just compare the results, and then you're just trying to get closer to it. And that kind of, if you project that further on, it kind of helps you to perhaps even turn these simulations into fortune-telling machines. The future, telling something about the future. Of course, there's a danger that I mean, if you build a fortune-telling machine, it kind of starts telling the fortune. It starts affecting actually the future. So we need to be careful about that. But otherwise, technology helps us to think and understand things most of all.
Now the new iPhone 10 has got an artificial intelligence chip specifically built in to recognize your face movements so that you can have emoji animated following you tracking your face and become your own personal emoji. So I guess in the next 3 or 4 months, probably the most commonly accepted definition of artificial intelligence would be responsive emoji, right? Because now we are more or less 50 people here discussing this idea of technology, but there will be perhaps 500 million that will in fact practice it in that way, right? So something that maybe is also interesting to discuss is how perhaps all this experimentation that we are doing can affect the way a larger audience or a larger public can experience these aspects of technology. And for me, this is always a kind of a conundrum that I'm trying to solve. And obviously, it's in some of the experiments in YAC, for instance, there is a very interesting way of reaching out to the population and to engaging larger set of people in this type of technology. But maybe it's also interesting and necessary to define, more clearly what is the difference, in fact, between the kind of technology we're talking about and what, in fact, I guess it's the most common understanding of the term. And if you talk about artificial intelligence in particular, this will be the case also.
Sorry, I just want to tell you an anecdote. I mean, if Claudia basically kind of interesting because she invited us to somehow speculate on a possible future where technology starts to be self-sufficient, from autonomous to self-sufficient. But we are already living in this scenario. I mean, we already have some sort of new species that now operates through steel wires and cables that somehow is changing and shifting the behavior of our society. And just to do a practical example, I mean, in Zara last year, during the first day of sales, was sold €1 million online and 14 million euro on the shops. Then they applied a machine learning technique using and analyzing the behavior of people online, proposing on the website what you like, the color that you like, the possible dress that you like, and in 1 year we shifted to 15 millions online and 14 millions on the shop. So aside from the fact that they double the amount of incomes. So in any case, it's shifting the behavior of people, of our society, it's shifting our, our custom, attitudes or whatever, behaviors and habits, yes. So, I mean, it's a dystopic future as I am describing it, but it's already happening. It's just the very beginning of something new that we will have to deal with. Be happy. Still, you can smile. I mean, nothing tragic yet.
I think I have to kind of pick up from these kind of two before we kind of move to the audience or to further kind of questions. One is precisely this kind of iPhone business, A-level bionic neural edging, okay, and we still call it a phone. And this is something that I completely agree with Marco, and it's one of the things that I'll try to kind of bring through the discussion is the definition of things that we have but we don't have names, although we have names for things that we don't have. This is what Benjamin Bratton actually argues recently. So design is about designating, is about actually putting limits and putting stories out of there. And I would like to kind of see how architecture You know, how built environment, how the cities can actually take this kind of new formations with new concepts and new terms. Polycephalum city is not by accident named like this, not even by fun, but it is almost like a concept that opens up a new kind of possibility to see, to read the city in a kind of a different technological manner. And the second is precisely how technology, both of the examples, you know, designing the unknown, the market already know that it constructs the future. This is what Alan Kay said: if you want to invent the future, construct it, precisely because technology behaves more like a fortune teller, right? It's more like a projecting to the future. And although we're working with technology, I would like to kind of, I'm expecting after quite a few years, a more concrete definitions about how architecture has changed. We're talking about radical change of design, right? About how the built environment has been changed. The world is populated by these buildings, and we are kind of almost solipsistically talking about, you know, big ideas, confrontation of the unknown. George Bush knew what to do with the unknown. There are unknowns, so he attacked Iraq precisely because he wanted to do that. I think we need to kind of mobilize a discussion that kind of sets an agenda now in architectural and urban and design terms. And I think for us, this is what I want to ask to you, how you see your projects, how you see your research forming a design tactic for the post-Anthropocene. How is that good deal?
For me, I think it's very simple. It's designing with ecology so that the urban landscape buildings are actually thought of as part of an ecological environment rather than separate from it. And therefore interiors have to be controlled in a particular way. It means that our materials that we're working with are softer, more porous, that the technologies are more diverse. I think that the languages that we use will change as to how we attribute work and design, and where those exactly exist in a complex system in which you can make a perturbation and either nothing happens or you get the butterfly effect and there's something kind of amazing going on somewhere else. And I also think that kind of this issue of technology is, so someone like Kurt van Mensvoet will be saying that actually with time technology recedes into the background. We're foregrounding let's say the novelty of certain technologies at the moment, but things like orchards, they were a technology in the agrarian age, and so were canals. I mean, so that our concept of what technology is really kind of foregrounded by the kind of the tools and the culture that we're in. So very simply, architecture is a kind of design with ecology.
Well, I'm really struggling with the example that Aldo gave. Because if I connect back to the idea that I proposed before of stay with the trouble or work within the trouble, then I'm really troubled because the current paradigm is completely about applying this type of research to an objectified context in which society is consumer of object and doesn't interact with any pattern of biological or artificial intelligence. So the only pattern is this pattern of consumption of objects. So if we want to apply what Rachel was saying now and what we have been saying since 2 days, then it means we need to discard the old system that exists, and I have no clue of how we are doing that. So that is, I think, a problematic that needs to be discussed because, as Marco pointed out, we are 50 here, but then there are millions seeing the paradigm from the opposite side. Mm-hmm. So where this type of research is not speculated upon philosophically or how it could change society, but is used to fit in the system that exists now, which is about consuming a single object and not interacting with data or not interacting with patterns. So not being inside of the trouble, but being still completely zoomed out from it.
I mean, I absolutely agree about your vision, but you also know that in Nel Gattopardo, from Tommasi de Lampedusa, right? I'm probably the only one that knows it, but there is one quote that says that everything should change in order not to change anything of our society, right? And you saw what happened with the Brexit, you saw what happened with the amazing president in the US, and behind there was the same company that was basically using the behavior, collecting the data from Facebook and understanding the behavior of people inside the social media, inside the social network. I don't know how many of you knows this story. If you know it, I will not tell it, but basically they were feeding into the single Facebook of each one of the users news that were somehow solidifying the perception and their politically let's say, inclination, somehow pushing the people towards voting for the Brexit or towards voting for Trump. So as anything in our world, you can use technology for the good or for the bad. That's the truth behind it, no? But there are, for sure, I mean, there are systems and other kind of organizations that would like to keep things, as Tommasi de Lampedusa said, as they are, but just using more sophisticated means, right? And you can keep smiling now.
Okay, I think we should actually give the microphone down to the audience to kind of reflect on these kind of 2 days, not only today, but you had the experience from yesterday as well. Is this kind of idea of the polycephalum city, and is this kind of idea of the Anthropocene, this kind of, we have defined it, questions can be raised about it, what is Anthropos, who we are, where are we coming from? Or meanwhile, I can give to Heather the microphone and tell me what it feels like to be a slime mold.
We'll never know what it feels like to be a slime mold. The bee and slime mold experiment is intended to fail. It's not a real attempt to be a slime mold. It's an attempt to try to think in a decentered, non-human-centered way. So how does another organism relate to its environment from its own subjectivity? So yes, it's an attempt to leave our centric position for a moment. But I wanted to say something kind of picking up on these things about control, because I think that's the center of it. A lot of the systems that we're looking at for inspiration or kind of for biointegration within these systems are self-organizing. They're decentralized and non-hierarchical, which is a huge point of conflict to human systems, which are entirely hierarchical and utterly top-down control. And I think that's where the tension is in how do we build resilient cities or resilient systems and infrastructures that are adaptive and can kind of follow evolutionary processes without kind of within the systems that are utterly hierarchical. And I think it's trying to break down those hierarchies is the only way that we're ever going to actually do it. And look at kind of Facebook and the social media examples that you were giving. The internet was seen as an emergent system that was kind of decentralized and democratic. But it has been kind of harnessed and repurposed, and the feedback loops that it's creating are affecting our behavior in not very positive ways. So kind of understanding those layers of control I think is important.
Okay, should I give the microphone down to a question or comment? Oh, you have a microphone, okay.
Hello, yeah. First of all, thank you for the very interesting and stimulating discussions. I have a question regarding the duality between sort of this visual of sustainability, the greenification, the populist visual, and the dark side of the city, as Marco named it, or the hidden city on the other side. And I believe that this duality was created by the same sort of separation between the liquid and the sort of object city that Rachel discussed. But the creation of a more sort of hybrid ecology, in my mind, would require sort of moral discussions regarding the relationship of human body and the city, and sort of, you know, bringing together discussions about human waste management and so on. I think this is not a simple issue to many people who have been raised in this duality. So how to confront the moral side, engaging concepts like purity and health, cleanliness, and so on?
I think that question's really spot on. I mean, I think that with this shift, the only thing that's going to help us make decisions is not, you know, kind of accurate predictions, but having an integrity in terms of, you know, who we are and where we want to be in the world. So it's a deeply ethical and kind of value-based system. And I would say that maybe one way of starting to make an incursion into that space, you know, kind of given the darkness, is to actually think about linking the cycles of life and death. At the moment in modernity, we look for life, and it's more growth, more life, and we move away from composting, decay, the kind of taking apart of matter and its kind of reassembly through the soil. And you know, I know the soil is a Marxist kind of trope. I don't actually really mean it in a Marxist way. What I mean it is in a kind of a way in which, when we think about regeneration and growth, we actually have to think of those processes of disassembly. So by engaging with life and death, and not making that a taboo, not making it a failure of something, perhaps that is one pathway that we might be able to employ, so that when we're thinking about disposal of garbage, can we think through the process of garbage production and think it differently. There's a fantastic book by William Bryant Logan called Dirt, The Ecstatic Skin of the Earth. And he works with this, he's a devotee of this guy called Hans Jenny. He's not the Hans Jenny of cymatics, he's a different Hans Jenny that works with Earth. And he talks about the composting process. When there's not enough oxygen, it absolutely stinks and it smells toxic and there's a horrible landscape. But when compost is given oxygen and hay and has the right balance, the process is actually, he was saying it was smelling like, you know, like oranges, you know. Like, I don't know whether he's got a different kind of olfactory system than me, but you know, he was actually talking about them as a bouquet, like we would with alcohol, which is a form of, you know, fermentation. So I mean, I think that there are simple shifts that we can make that can not necessarily solve everything, but maybe help us think slightly differently.
That was actually the opening sentence of the second sentence of this morning, in which you were saying that polycephalum address biological and artificial intelligence in dealing with stability and instability and how they coexist. It was exactly to try and discuss the life cycles, not as something that is described by sustainability. I take this, I put it there, and then I move it here. I offset the 300 trees in the Amazon, and then I fly in the other place, and it's all completely disconnected. But it's about how being embedded in the system of life, death, stability, instability, can we establish an interaction with the system itself from within. So it's not a question of segregating again or zoning of different type of product that are good or bad. They are a continuum. They are a continuum system with which we need to establish a form of interaction.
I was recently spent some time in Pittsburgh as part of a visiting teaching job I did there, and Pittsburgh was one of these shrinking cities, right? That you know, the Rust Belt, American Rust Belt, and I remember now maybe more than 10 years ago I was exposed to this project studying shrinking cities like Detroit, etc. And like I think that they were among the first in which these whole ideas of urban agriculture and so on were were emerging, precisely because, of course, there were a lot of empty space and the land was very, very cheap and so on, right? But I think not just because of that, I think because also of the kind of total lack of money, if you want, and options in terms of work. Like, of course, there was the necessity to look a sort of alternative way of inhabiting those spaces, which were urban but effectively very low density, inhabited by less and less people, right? And so my experience of Pittsburgh, which is now, let's say, gone beyond that moment of like total, if you want, decay in that sense, and is somehow regrowing in a different way, and it's attracting a lot of, for instance, young people that are kind of living, for instance, in New York because of the sort of super high costs of life, etc., and are kind of moving back or moving to Pittsburgh and starting businesses which are in some cases dealing with technology, in fact, in other cases dealing with farming or urban agriculture, etc. But all of them I felt with a fairly kind of interesting perspective, which is in fact I think evolved in this kind of experience they had of kind of moving out of a city where nothing was happening, and then kind of joining the crazy big booming cities, and now kind of coming back. And I mean, this is to say that in a way, this kind of a shift of like you were saying, away from the kind of narrative of continuous growth and kind of proliferation of life, etc., etc. And when you look at that into kind of urban dynamics, I think it's interesting, specifically when you see these sort of cities that shrunk and then they are now kind of going through another cycle. They are different, no? And they actually develop new potentials and new perspectives, and I think maybe that is also something that we could look at in terms of I don't know, cities like Tallinn, where you have areas that for many years have been kind of left abandoned, and in a way or another have been already appropriated by mainly young people, but probably not only, and it's already becoming kind of fertile for a sort of new way of looking at this. And again, the last thing about Pittsburgh itself, that obviously, I remember also very clearly. Pennsylvania was one of the battleground, and Trump was making a big deal about the Rust Belt, bringing back industry, etc. And in Pittsburgh itself, of course, that narrative was completely rejected, and they were completely beyond that. And in a way, it's interesting the way. Somehow around the world still there is this narrative about the Rust Belt as kind of but on the ground is already completely different, no?
Yeah, I think there is also quite problematic or tricky how you find a middle ground between the positivistic approach of growth and the poeticization of aestheticization of waste, which to a certain extent I appreciate, but I think to another I think is problematic. Jill was mentioning Bortinsky, and I love Bortinsky movie and the way they depict polluted landscape, but on the other end, they create again a sort of top view and distance from the landscape itself. So that is part of life, and as pollution it is. And so my discourse about aesthetic at the beginning of the symposium was not about aestheticizing waste, and so falling in love with waste itself, although I tend to like it, but it's my problem. So it's not a question of creating an aesthetic of waste, it's rather different, is the question of how you use aesthetic as a language, as a mean, and design as a mean of interacting with the issue of growth and decrease and death. It's not a question of zooming out and having an overview of growth, or a question of zooming out and seeing, oh, actually this is a sublime landscape, although it's completely polluted.
Good. End of time? Okay. Is there any other question that cannot be left for another symposium? No, if there is any question, there are going to be people around, so you can grab him or grab her and ask. Thank you very much. Thanks for all your presentations and your answers. I would like to apologize if I was a bit difficult, but that's how discussion kind of moves on. Thank you for your patience, and this concludes the whole symposium, right? Do you want to say something about that then?
Is it on? Yes. I'll just say that, well, thanks a lot to the guest. Thanks a lot to the guests and to the people that participated to the symposium, and we'll see you all back tonight at 9 p.m. here without chairs. And for the gala. See you later. Thanks.